All right, what's up guys? In this video that I've been looking forward to making for a while, we're gonna learn how to paint or go over and try to play with painting like Bob Ross in Procreate. This video might get a little bit long, so I'm gonna try to timestamp the different sections down in the description. Hardware, I'm not using any pressure sensitivity. I've watched a lot of people on YouTube that will paint in Procreate like Bob Ross, and some of them are using Apple Pencil, some of them are using different techniques, and I'm kind of pulling from all of them. I recommend checking some other people out because I'll be painting in ways that I have found and kind of work for my workflow right now. I'm gonna be painting along with one of his actual videos. I've got it on another screen right now. The vast majority of the Bob Ross series is available for free on YouTube. The Joy of Painting, if you just look it up. A lot of my friends have been putting it on in the background just because the way that he talks is calming, it's soothing, it's very joyful, and an otherwise kind of perilous time, right? If you are watching it and you're learning his techniques and his styles for the first time, I recommend starting with like the first episode of a season. I'm gonna be looking at season 2, episode 1. In the first episode, he tends to go over the techniques a little bit more of the basics, and then in later episodes in each season, he starts scaffolding, he starts building on the techniques kind of thing. So I'm gonna be doing season 2, episode 1. Something that he says is talent is pursued interest. How we can interpret that or retranslate that is that I've been like trying to paint like Bob Ross a number of times now on this iPad, on another iPad. I've been doing this over and over and over again. My first few attempts on another iPad weren't that great. It took me a little bit to learn how to do it. And moral of the story there, if you see this one, I'm still learning how to like paint trees and bushes and stuff like that, right? The more that you do this, the more that you play and try and play and try, the better you're gonna get. Thing about Bob is that he's been doing this for so long, right? Like, not only had he been painting before the show, but when you have over 30 seasons of you painting landscapes, you get pretty good at being able to make things look easy. This, I do believe that anyone who is approaching painting in Procreate can do this. Grain of salt, right? So let's talk about brushes real quick, right? Because like brushes in Procreate are a whole beast to take on. A lot of artists on YouTube that I see will recommend working with only 1 or 2 brushes and get really good with 1 or 2 brushes so you don't overcomplicate things for yourself, and I like that idea. However, with Bob, he uses a handful of different brushes when he's painting, and he really does rely on the different textures of the different brushes that he uses. So I'm going to be using a few, and I'll have them slide across the screen just like he does with his colors. I can list them in the description as well, though I'm going to show you they're all coming from Procreate. All right, without further ado, let's get into it. If I just quickly open up one of these projects, you can see that I've got layers on layers on layers. I've like probably got upwards of like 30 different layers on here when you start including all the different duplicates. And that's what I want you to be doing, is to be, whenever you're drawing or painting something new, you can put it on a new layer and then you can merge layers if you need to later. But you can see just how I started to build all of this up. So let's get into it, right? I've been working at screen size. Bob's canvases are typically like 18 by 24 inches. So you can make like an 18 by 24 inch document at 300 PPI. I'm gonna be sticking with just the screen size for brevity. So now first 2 brushes for the background are just gonna be the airbrush. I'm just gonna be using under airbrush, the medium brush at 100% opacity and pretty big. And I'll be using that same brush to do some smudge work, right? So Bob starts to lay in backgrounds. He uses like phthalo blue. I'll just kind of grab a blue. I rarely go with the pure color. I usually use a little bit muted of a version. And then here's what I'm gonna do. I'm just gonna paint a few big strokes and then grab my smudge tool, again, medium brush, pretty big, and then I'm just gonna do these little X's that Bob does. My strength in the smudge is probably around like 30 to 40%. And just big little swift marks. It's okay if it's inconsistent. You don't wanna like, I'm gonna lower the brush size on that a little bit for the next ones. You don't wanna like make it too consistent of a color. One of the overarching goals of this is that we want our strokes to be painterly, and that means that we're not going to get too detailed. So Bob with his backgrounds typically makes around like the middle a little bit lighter. It's where the horizon's going to be, or where like the water or the mountains will meet kind of thing. He leaves that a little bit lighter. I would recommend using his like the smudge tool a little bit to make sure you don't see those hard edges anymore. Some of his backgrounds, he'll start to mix colors. A few of my examples had like different mixed colors. Up to you how you want to build it, right? It's Bob Ross. So for the clouds, I'm going to go ahead and start a new layer. And there's a few different ways for clouds, right? There really is a cloud brush in Procreate. And if you want to use the cloud brush, go after it, right? Though what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab close to white. I will rarely ever use pure white. I will rarely ever use pure black in my paintings. It's just a technique that I learned from actual traditional painting. And I'm going to use, a cooler white. And then I'm still going to use that medium brush for the clouds, right? Bob uses like a fan brush, or he'll use different kinds of brushes, but watch what I do. On a new layer, right? I'm gonna, in little circles, create the general shape of a cloud. Doesn't need to be perfect. All clouds are different. All clouds are unique, right? Grab our smudge tool, same smudge tool, right? And I'm just gonna pull some of that down, a little bit smaller on the smudge tool, and I'm gonna pull some of that out to create the foggy aesthetic of the clouds. As I'm watching Bob, as I'm sure many people do, I do a lot of like pausing. I pause a lot, right? He'll finish an episode in like 25 minutes, although for me the painting will take probably a little bit more than 25 minutes. Especially since I'm still trying to figure out what are the best techniques. With the clouds, I'll make sure that I do leave some hard edges. I can zoom in and still fog them a little bit, but I don't want the whole cloud to just be a blur in the sky. I'm smudging a lot of these paintings, but you don't want to get rid of all of your hard edges. So clouds typically have their brighter parts on top and then the darker parts on the bottom. Let's do another cloud. I got hair in my style. Bob calls them almighty clouds. He does like almighty trees and almighty mountains too. When I'm smudging clouds, I start by smudging down a little bit and then I also push it back up. And right now I've got both clouds in the same layer. So create my general shape, bring back a few of the edges, and then when in doubt, smudge it out. That's gonna be like our motto for a while. If you want to, you can bring back in some blue. Something that I start doing, right? At a certain point, I'm only gonna be picking colors from the canvas itself. I don't have all the colors yet, but watch what I can do. I use my middle button as an eyedropper, and then I can paint some blue back in. If you wanna like paint a little bit of texture in there and then smudge it out, create a little bit more dynamic shapes in your clouds. Bob, when he's smudging clouds, says to gently lift upward. I'm gonna grab and redefine that edge a little bit more and then smudge upward. So let's go for the mountains, right? I feel like the mountain is one of the biggest staples of Bob Ross. Bob often references Alaska when he's painting. I live over here in Chicago and in the Midwest. I use two main brushes for the mountains. One of which is under painting, the Nico roll brush, right? I'm at 100% opacity, and then the size I'll vary up. For the mountains, I'm gonna use a pretty dark. He mixes a Prussian blue with some crimson and some other things, but he creates a very dark color, almost deep violet. So I'll go ahead and push around the color wheel and then just carve out the shape of the mountain. He uses a palette knife. We don't really have a palette knife, but I like the texture that comes with the Nico roll brush. So check out how I go about drawing this mountain on a new layer. I'm gonna start with the general shape, and it's okay where you put it. As long as it's on its own layer, you can put that mountain wherever you want. Bob would be proud at you putting the mountain in a different place that you want. I'm creating, the reference of a few peaks. I'm gonna start with the outline, fill a little bit in. I dot around a lot. Maybe grab an eraser, the eraser tool. I'll erase with the Nico roll as well. Ooh, too big. Just start to carve that mountain out, right? The mountains can look however you want them, or however they wind up the first time you paint them, right? So once you get the shape of it like that, now we're gonna use that same smudge brush, right? For the smudge tool, I'm gonna use the medium brush, again, around 30 to 40% strength, and then Bob just smudges things down. I'll grab the brush a little bigger, and he smudges, or he blends. For Bob, it's blending. For us, it's smudging, right? He blends things down. And what that's gonna do is that's gonna create like the mist that's gonna fade, and we're not gonna see the bottom of the mountain, right? We're gonna see like a tree line or a lake. Pull it around, and it's on its own layer, so I can move that whenever I want to. If I don't like the position of the mountain, I can grab my arrow tool and I can move it, I can transform it. Like, I can do whatever I want with this mountain. But now I need to smudge away that hard edge from the edge of the canvas. When in doubt, smudge it out. Let's talk about the highlights and the shadows. There's a lot of different ways you can do that. There's a lot of different brushes you could. I'm gonna paint the highlights and the shadows of the mountain on a separate layer, but with that layer, I will clipping mask it. Tap the layer, clipping mask. So this layer will only paint on top of the layer beneath it. I'm only painting on the mountain. Easy, right? So for the highlights, let's say the highlights are on the right and the shadow side of the mountain is on the left. I start with my dark. Bob always starts with his darks. So for the highlights, I'll grab an almost white, maybe bring that color up a little bit, almost white. The brush that I'm using for the texture of the mountains and for the highlights and shadows of the mountains, the one that I've been using under charcoals is Burnt Tree. It works out, 100% opacity. I'm gonna vary up the brush size a little bit. Now, Bob paints the highlights on the right side most often. You can vary it up, but you wanna have a consistent light source. And then you pull it down, and you start on the right peaks and pull it down, and then leave some room for where your shadows are eventually gonna exist, right? That one will probably stop there because the shadow comes down. And that's it. You can see that this Burnt Tree brush really has that mountainy texture to it that Bob gets naturally with his palette knife. Beauty of painting digitally is that you can pause whenever you want. You don't need to worry about the paint staying wet or the paint drying. You can pause the videos. Bob has these moments. I'm gonna start painting those reflections. Bob has these moments that he calls like bravery tests, where he takes like a big brush, or he starts making like a really big mark that would normally like freak someone out about like, oh no, I'm gonna mess up the painting. What's awesome about bravery tests when you're painting digitally is you can undo. So again, there's no reason to think that you can't do it or that you've messed up a painting. I think Bob would like that. I don't know, actually. I don't know Bob very well. There's a lot of like mythos and lore about Bob Ross, right? I'm pretty sure he was like a drill sergeant or something. I don't know. He's a good human who enjoys creating, enjoys imagination, enjoys spreading joy. And that's what we should care about. What I'm doing is I'm painting in the reflected light of the mountain. So I have the darkest underneath. Bob always starts darks first. And then I've got my highlights and then my shadows, right? So darks, highlights, then shadows. And there it is. There's a Bob Rossy looking mountain. You can see I left some little like edges where it's neither the highlight nor the reflected shadow. It's just the dark underneath. But boom, that's that. Again, that layer is clipping masked. If you want to, you can go through and trim things up with an eraser. Still got that Nico roll as an eraser. Bob does begin to smudge or blend his mountains out too, so we can just take our smudge tool again, that just hard edge, and start to smudge these out so they kind of like the edges of our blending or the edges of our texture join the fog at the base. Big almighty mountain. Alaska. All right, let's get into land masses, right? Land masses I'm gonna do again with the Nico roll brush. What's most important that he starts teaching here is the layering, the different layers that we're building up, different layers that are coming towards the viewer, right? Because generally, what is furthest away, based on atmospheric perspective, is gonna be closest to gray. As things are far away from us, they get closer and closer to gray. And things that are closer are gonna get slowly and slowly more dark. So I'm gonna start with a green for the landmass, just like, a typical Kelly green, not too vibrant because we're emulating paint here. And what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna, with a little bit larger of a Nico roll brush, I'm gonna start to buff out a little bit of a landmass line, right? And you can, I'm squiggling a little bit, I dash a lot, like a little like dash, dash, dash a lot with this. But I'm not gonna worry too much about where it goes because I can change it later. And then what I can do is I can smudge the edge down. When in doubt, smudge it out, and that's literally how I'm going about this. I'm not gonna stick to one color when I'm doing this. One of my original art teachers, Mrs. Wendy Gus, she taught me when I was in high school, and now here I am teaching high school art. One of the first things that she ever told me in a drawing and painting class, when I was first learning, the first time I ever did it, is this idea of pushing around the color wheel, that one color is no color. That's what she said. One color is no color. I remember her saying that my freshman year of high school. I remember her saying that my senior year of high school, and it stuck with me. What she means by that, one color is no color, is that we are going to push around the color wheel as we paint. Rather than just sticking with this one green, check this out. I'm gonna push around the color wheel a little bit and grab some more shades of different greens here. And I'm gonna bring it in and then blend it out, right? One color is no color. We gotta push around the color wheel. Something else that Bob teaches though, is that you wanna make sure that your darks are at or like the darkest parts are at the bottom. The darkest parts are at the bottom, so I'm gonna go ahead and build out these different planes, these different layers of the composition. And I can build in another layer on the other side too. Maybe similar colors, maybe like starting with the darks on this one, bring it all the way over, smudge it out a little bit, and then begin to push around the color wheel. And we'll get some like darker blues in there too for this bottom. Bob uses like a cool technique here that's like where he starts like splattering and creating textures. I'll get into that with like different bushes and different trees as well. Push around the color wheel, block some more in. Let's get this a little bit more teal. Yeah, there you go. A little bit more teal in there. So what I'm doing right now is like I'm painting with a pretty wide range of colors. If you notice, none of them are too strong. None of them are the pure colors. Some of my favorite ones that Bob does though are where he just uses like black, gray, blue, and white kind of thing. If I go back to my stack real quick, paintings like this, right, where it's just a limited color scheme. I think that makes it easier to start with because you're not too worried about the colors coordinating and all that. If I bring the layers back in this one, look at that background with the different cloud brushes in there. Boom, there's my mountains for this painting, right? Here's some more layers. You know, painting with all these cool, brilliant colors of nature is awesome. As a graphic design teacher, I can't help but appreciate the limited color palettes of different paintings that Bob does. But let's get back to this beautiful, colorful Alaskan nature scene. Before I get too carried away, let's bring in some of this like blue over here too, just so I have a little bit of consistency. When in doubt, smudge it out, and then rebuild. Smudge, rebuild, or erase, or clear, or... All right, let's get into the evergreen trees. The evergreen trees are like a staple of Bob's landscapes. Now, Bob uses a fan brush, right? Like a fan-out brush where the bristles all create that texture. I haven't been able to get a nice-looking fan brush. We're gonna start with a pretty dark blue-green here, close to black. The brush that I've been using, I've been playing with a few of them. It's in charcoal. And I'm using not the burnt tree this time, but the willow charcoal. And I'm not gonna be able to create, there's the stamp of the different texture of Bob's evergreen trees. Instead, I'm gonna do a little bit of a zigzag line. I think my evergreen trees take a lot longer than Bob's evergreen trees, because Bob is able to just really quickly go with his fan brush, but it creates a very similar result, and that's what we're going for today. So on a new layer, let's go ahead, and I start mine with a line. I'll place it anywhere. It doesn't matter what size, we can scale it or resize it later, but I'm gonna start with a line generally, and I'm staying sketchy. Notice how I'm doing like multiple swipes. I'm not drawing ever like, I can't draw a straight line, but I can sketch and create a painterly aesthetic. I'm gonna start with a line, and then I'm gonna start to almost like zigzag and like rounded sway across, right? So we go and like that, and then start to curve our lines and build it up, right? And now we're creating the simple shape of an evergreen tree. Again, Bob does this in like really quick stamps. It takes me a little bit longer. If you know of a better way or a better brush that's native in Procreate to build evergreen trees like Bob Ross does, comment about it. Let me know. Bob always mentions that like the evergreen trees are always going to be darkest and like towards the middle, so I'm going to go ahead and try to make sure you can't see that original line in the middle, because that's where you've got, you know, the most branches all around the tree in 360 degrees. There's one, right? I can go ahead, and what's like what is like the beauty of this is if I duplicate that layer, check this out, I can grab my arrow tool, move it, rescale it as a free form, maybe make this one thinner, flip it horizontally, warp it a little bit, and yeah, that's cool. Bob makes his evergreen brushes with really quick stamps, and I gotta swipe the entire time, but Bob ain't duplicating layers, is he? Play with this a little bit, you know, put that layer behind. Bob says every tree needs a friend, everyone needs a friend, I guess. Cool. Or I could, on another layer, keep building it up. I don't think you need every single evergreen tree you paint to be on its own layer. You can start doing groups of them. Start with a line. Let's give these trees a neighbor. I can tap with 2 fingers to undo. It's okay if there's like little spaces. The goal isn't to just create an entirely filled up, you know, jagged area. Because if you've ever seen evergreen trees in Alaska, I grew up in an area where we had a lot of spruce trees on the street that I grew up on. So for me, spruce trees made a lot more sense than evergreen trees, and they're basically the same thing. I actually don't know if they're even different. I am not a botanist. So I've played and I've experimented, and there's different ways to make Bob's tree lines. Sometimes Bob will create tree lines by just doing like lots of like little strokes that just looks like trees in the distance. One brush that might be able to help us with that, I'm gonna go ahead and make a new layer and put it behind my evergreen trees. I've used the short hairbrush in the touch-ups a little bit. Still 100% opacity. I've been working with 100% opacity with all these brushes so far, right? And if we do that in like little lines, we can create, you know, the distant illusion of more tree lines. So notice how I'm just like building that up, right? We can create the distant illusion of more tree lines. If I wanted to, I could like build that up with the willow charcoal too, a smaller willow charcoal brush. Trim that edge a little bit. And that's like one way to create the distant illusion of trees. As things get further back, right, they lose detail, so we don't need to be too worried about how detailed these evergreen trees look. Let's do a few more, let's go crazy. So you could like paint your trees exactly where Bob's painting. If you listen to Bob as he's talking, he always says that like the goal isn't to paint exactly what he's doing, that you make your own world, that you don't paint exactly his world that he's painting, that he's just showing you the techniques, and there's a lot of good merit to that, right? That, you know, we're painting, we're literally making something up, you can make it however you want to. I like that and all, that like this idea that, you know, take the techniques that I'm teaching you, take the technique, like this is what I tell my students all the time, right? Take the techniques that I'm teaching you, learn what I'm teaching you, and then go make something of your own with it, right? And then like use your imagination. As I teach graphic design, I also acknowledge that sometimes it just makes sense to copy. You learn a lot through copying. You learn a lot through copying. You learn a lot through imitating. Some of the greatest artists have learned through imitating and through copying. Michelangelo, you know, the painter, the sculptor of the statue of David, the painter of the Sistine Chapel ceiling, right? The creation of Adam and all that. Michelangelo's first career was forging sculptures, was selling forged sculptures. What that did for him is, one, it got him in the process of making, and two, it taught him how to make something that was already good. Paul Rand, this famous graphic designer, has a really good quote that I like that says, "Don't try to be original, try to be good." And I do like that a lot. So I like, when I'm watching Bob, I'm learning how he paints, and then after I get good from learning from him, then I can go off and paint on my own. Let's once again make our lives easier. Let's duplicate. Let's adjust. So something that we could do as we're like copying and pasting is always be like adjusting, right? That's something that we do all the time in digital animation is we copy layers, we paste layers, and we adjust layers. And that speeds up our process a lot. And it's not a new technique at all. Animators for the last 100 years have been doing that, right? Where they take another animation and animate on top of it, called rotoscoping, right? They animate on top of it, and that just speeds up their processes, right? And that's copying. That's making your process easier. If I wanted to grab my lasso tool, I could like try to select like individual trees and scale them. If I wanted to, I could like change things up, put things down on a baseline, and that looks good. One almighty evergreen tree, right? Something that I think about a lot, like with Bob painting, is that I was always taught to paint and draw and sculpt. Whenever you're making something, paint, draw, sculpt, looking at like a reference, right? Looking at like a reference photo. So my instinct right now is to like, you know, load up ye old Google and look at some images of evergreen trees and spruce trees and stuff like that, right? Though Bob does this interesting thing where he's never looking, he's just making from the imagination. What Bob has done, why Bob's able to do that is because he's been painting these landscapes for so long that it's kind of in his like inventory in his brain, right? He doesn't need to be looking at a photo or sitting in front of an actual landscape to paint it. He's making all this stuff up, but he's painted trees before, right? Something that Bob does a lot is he adds on, like if we're drawing like a snow scene, he'll add on highlights and shadows. Let's go ahead and pretend that this is in a snow scene, or I'll just give it highlights and shadows in one way. What you can do with your layers is if you alpha lock them real quick, if I'm gonna tap that alpha lock, what that means is now I can only draw on the pixels that I've already drawn. So what I can do with these colors is I can grab a relatively lighter green based off the light source of my mountain, you know, the light's over there, and I can just add some like little highlights, not too many. I'm not, you know, buffing out the entire right side of the tree. If you're drawing a snow scene, this would be white because this would be the snow on the bristles, right? And then you want to, just like the mountains, you have your dark base, brighter highlight. Let's go ahead and grab a little bit cooler of a reflected shadow. I'm probably going to be doing even less of that, a little bit darker there. And that's just a way to create some dimension to your trees. I could do that with all the trees in the scene. Maybe I'll take care of that later. I just want to get through this already long video. Something else that Bob does, really before he does the highlights and shadows, look at me, is he adds in like the hint or the impression that there's trunks with a highlight. He does that by just scraping with his palette knife. We could scrape, we could, you know, take it like an eraser kind of thing. But what I'm gonna do is, in inking, I'm gonna use the ink bleed brush really thin with a pretty bright color. Not pure white, generally the color scheme that we're sticking in. And then you can just, right, scrape to create the illusion. Even smaller, even smaller. I'm gonna undo those and do even smaller for the trees in the distance. But you could just scrape, too big, scrape to create the illusion of like the tree trunks kind of thing. And we zoom out, we can kind of see that. Yeah, I don't like that one. It's too big. So let's go ahead and just touch that up with the eraser a little bit. And there it is. Next up, let's do bushes and other kinds of trees. This is something that I'm still figuring out. One brush that I have been using that I saw another artist using with a completely different landscape, non-Bob Ross painting, is under artistic, the Larapuna brush. This is the only brush that I'm using at a decreased opacity. I'm using it right around 50% opacity. And what that allows me to do is to build up colors, right? So as Bob builds his bushes, his other trees, he starts dark and builds light. Let's go yellow. Let's go like, you know, fall, autumnal yellow. Not too pure of a yellow. Start a little bit darker. Dark yellow is really just brown, right? Or just gold, right? And then I'm just gonna dot and tap and start to build up that. So you can see how this Larapuna brush works, is that it actually kind of picks up colors in the area, even though it's on its own layer, right? And that texture really does kind of emulate the texture of the brush that Bob kind of presses in with. So I start with a dark one. I can add some highlights on that if I wanted to, push around the color wheel, add some highlights, a little bit smaller of a brush for the highlights. And then as always, when in doubt, smudge it out a little bit, I'm gonna go ahead and create some layers with this. Watch, like at this point, if you see that I'm keep tapping the middle button to pick a new color, I'm not going to my color wheel too much anymore. I'm grabbing colors that are already on my canvas. And then as always, layer, layer, layer. No pressure sensitivity here. The reason being I'm using the 50% opacity there. Bob here will also add like different colors for the seasons. He might add like a little bit of red in there. He might add like more stronger oranges. We can add an orange bush. Maybe if I do like a layer beneath it, we add orange, some bushes that already started to experience fall. It's currently January as I'm painting this. Let's add a little bit of a highlight there too. Check this out. With the Larapuna, on top of these, another brush that I have liked to use is under spray paints, the Flicks brush, right? 100% opacity, but you can change up the colors of that, and that creates these little dots of texture there too. Don't go overboard with this one. Definitely don't go overboard with this one. I say as I go overboard with it. All right, here we go. I'm gonna fast forward a little bit. But not least, or close to last but not least, let's talk about water. Bob does water in a bunch of different ways. Sometimes he'll have water go all the way up, like to the middle of the painting. Sometimes he'll like draw out. Something cool that he does, what I can do now that I have all of this, is I can just start merging layers together, right? If I flick to the right on a bunch of layers and then pinch them all, I can like from the top to the bottom pinch, or I can just click on one and merge down. I'm gonna merge all of my foreground layers. Because what Bob does is while the paint is still wet, he'll create some water by smudging the whole like lake. So check this out. If I smudge everything around this area down, if I just start smudging things down, not too consistently, we start creating some basic reflections. Then what I could do, layer above that with my Nico roll, I'll build a little bit of like a water edge, a little bit of that like phthalo blue, and I'll try to see where I was creating that line there, figure out where that water line was, and then smudge that down as well. I start to, you know, lose some of that blue that I just painted, and that's okay. I'm gonna smudge it back and forth to the side now. Water gets this blue color from the sky, but it very often reflects things that are going on around it, and it gets its color from its surroundings. So I'm smudging things down, right? I'm smudging things down to create the illusion of water. That's how Bob does it. And then smudge back and forth to the side, and I can do that on both layers very lightly here. So to really define the water, what Bob will do is he'll take his palette knife and scrape. For us, we're gonna go back and grab that inking brush, the ink bleed, and with an almost white, we'll draw a water line. We'll just kind of scrape where we see the edge of our water, and that helps define the surface of the water a lot more. Bob will then add a little bit of brown. He'll do a little bit of, he uses Van Dyke brown. Brown is for us just like a dark orange, right? I'm going to use the Nico roll again, a little bit smaller this time, and then just draw a little bit of dirt where that water is meeting. Maybe a little bit darker for that brown on this side. A little bit of dirt, just like I drew my land masses earlier, and then smudge that. Man, I love the power of undoing. From there, just, you know, it could be building more layers. It can be building like a even darker, a little bit of like a tree or bush layer with the Larapuna. But we are closing in on the end here. A little bits of maybe other colors. This is probably where we could do like a little bit of like fall colors, right? Like, there's a little orange on these bushes here. That's a bright orange. I'm gonna mute that. I'm gonna mute that. This is why we don't use those too strong of colors. Go at it with the flicks, pick colors from the document. After that, Bob typically just goes to sign it. He typically signs it in red. We could timestamp it, date it. You know, there's all different ways to do this, right? There's all different kinds of brushes to use for this. There's all different kinds of landscapes to paint. The more you do it though, the more you do it, the better you're gonna get. The more you watch while you're doing it, the better you're gonna get. And that's really the main ethos behind painting like Bob Ross, is that talent is pursued interest. Hopefully this helps get the start. Thanks for watching. Take care.